There's a name that still stops people cold. A name that carried the sound of Merlin engines over the English Channel, the smell of aviation fuel, the weight of a nation's survival. Spitfire. But this story isn't about the sky, it's about the road, and about how a small, two-seat British Roadster, built on the bones of a family saloon, designed by an Italian, and nearly killed before it ever left the factory, ended up becoming the car that made America fall in love with Britain all over again. Not Hollywood, not the Beatles, not Bond, a car. Roughly 45% of every Spitfire ever built ended up in the United States. Out of 314,000 cars produced over 18 years, nearly half crossed the Atlantic and found their way into the garages, driveways, and hearts of American men who had never set foot in England, but who suddenly understood exactly what the British meant by the phrase, sports car. This is that story, and there are parts of it that nobody talks about. Let's go back to a Britain still rebuilding, still paying its war debts, still figuring out what it was going to be in the post-war world. By the late 1950s, Standard Triumph, the British manufacturer that owned the Triumph name, was watching a rival do something interesting. Austin Healey had launched the Sprite in 1958. Small car, cheap car, 2 seats, not much power, not much weight, and it was selling. Proving there was enormous appetite, particularly in America, for an affordable little sports car that anyone could buy, drive hard, and feel like a racing driver on a Sunday morning. Triumph looked at the Sprite and thought, we can do better than that. The project they started was internally codenamed Bomb. Not exactly a name that inspires confidence, but it tells you something about the attitude inside that factory. Direct, a little dangerous, and not interested in playing it safe. They brought in Giovanni Michelotti, an Italian designer from Turin, who had already shaped the Triumph Herald saloon. Michelotti had a rare gift. He could conceive a car, sketch it, model it, and hand it back fully formed in a fraction of the time anyone else needed. He designed the Spitfire's body so quickly, and got it so right on the first attempt, that the production version barely changed from his original prototype. Low waistline, long bonnet, short tail, a one-piece front end that tilted forward like a clamshell, roll-up windows, when rivals still used crude side curtains. Front disc brakes, when rivals were making do with drums. This wasn't just a cheap car. This was a cheap car that didn't look or feel cheap. That distinction was going to mean everything. But then the money ran out, and the bomb sat forgotten under a dust sheet in a factory corner waiting for the moment that would either save it or bury it permanently. Standard Triumph hit a wall. Financial trouble, mismanagement, the brutal economics of post-war British industry all converging at once. The prototype was finished. It was sitting in the factory, and nobody was doing anything with it. In 1961, Leyland Motors stepped in and took over Standard Triumph. New management, new eyes, walking the factory floors in Coventry. And one of those executives, Leyland's managing director Stanley Markland, happened to walk past that corner, happened to notice the shape under the sheet, happened to pull it back. What he saw stopped him. On July 13, 1961, Markland approved it for production. The bomb had been saved. This time, it had the money and momentum to become a real car. Now came the name. And this is a detail almost nobody knows. The name Spitfire was not simply chosen off a list. It was the result of a negotiation. Air Marshal Tedder, who chaired Standard Triumph, wanted that name badly enough to trade for it. The deal struck with Vickers Aircraft was simple. Triumph could use Spitfire on their new car, in exchange for allowing Vickers to use the name Vanguard on one of their aircraft. A quiet gentleman's agreement, and one of the most consequential brand decisions in British automotive history. Because that name carried freight that no marketing budget could buy, every man in Britain and a significant portion of Americans knew what a Spitfire was: speed, precision. Something forged in crisis that performed beyond all reasonable expectation. The car debuted at the London Motor Show in October of 1962. Price, in the UK, £641. In the United States, under $2,200. At that price, With that styling, with those features, it immediately outsold both its main British rivals combined. Car and driver was so taken with the visual connection between the car and the aircraft that they ran a cover photograph showing the new Spitfire Roadster alongside one of the vintage wartime fighters. Triumph turned that photograph into a poster. It became one of the most iconic pieces of automotive marketing of the decade. America didn't just buy the car. America adopted it. And here's what drove that adoption in ways the numbers don't capture. The men who were the primary buyers of sports cars in 1962 and 63 were in their late 20s and 30s. Men who had grown up with the name Spitfire, connected to courage, precision, and a particular kind of British cool that America had long admired. Driving one felt like owning a piece of something that mattered. But the real question wasn't whether America would fall for it. The question was whether the car could hold up its end of the bargain, whether it could actually perform. That answer was about to arrive on a racetrack, and it would change everything. Pay close attention here, because this is where the Spitfire stopped being a pretty face and started becoming a legend. Amateur sports car racing in the United States in the 1960s was a genuine cultural phenomenon. The Sports Car Club of America, the SCCA, ran championships that drew thousands of participants. These weren't professional circuits with factory teams and corporate budgets. These were dentists and engineers and salesmen who prepared their cars on weekends in their garage and went racing because it was the most alive thing they had ever done. The Spitfire slotted into the SCCA's G production class, and it didn't just compete, it dominated. It won numerous SCCA national sports car championships in that class, year after year, driven by ordinary men who simply had the right car under them. Then it went international. In 1964, a works-prepared Spitfire entered the Tour de France, rally, the grueling automotive endurance event that crossed France through mountain passes. It won its class and finished second overall against international competition. That same year, a Spitfire won the Geneva Rally outright. In 1965, at Sebring in Florida, one of the most prestigious endurance events in American motorsport, Spitfires finished second and third in class. Factory tuning kits could push the four-cylinder past 70 horsepower using revised manifolds, twin Weber carburetors, and a higher performance camshaft. Think about what this meant practically. A man who bought a Spitfire for the road on Saturday could, with the right preparation, take it to an SCCA event on Sunday and be genuinely competitive. The boundary between road car and race car was almost non-existent. Sales in America responded accordingly. If you're finding this story worth your time, this is the moment to subscribe to this channel. We go deep every week on the cars, the people, and the moments that shaped the world we grew up in. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us whether you ever drove a Spitfire or saw one in the flesh, and if this is connecting with you, share it with someone who'll appreciate it. Now, there's something the brochures never mentioned. A hidden problem built into the Spitfire from the very beginning. The kind of problem that, if you pushed the wrong way at the wrong moment, could get you into serious trouble. The Triumph Spitfire's rear suspension used a swing axle arrangement. A single transverse leaf spring, with the rear wheels attached in a way that allowed them to change their angle dramatically as the suspension moved. In normal driving, this was fine. On a smooth road at sensible speeds, the Spitfire handled beautifully light, responsive, communicative. But push it hard into a fast corner, and something happened that Triumph's engineers knew about, and that the automotive press gently described as oversteer tendencies. What actually happened was this. Under hard cornering, the loaded rear tire could tuck inward, camber changing dramatically, and the car would try to swap ends, violently, without much warning. Mercedes had the same issue with their small cars. Volkswagen knew it with the Beetle. This was a known characteristic of the design. Triumph managed it with tuning and improved spring rates, rather than addressing the fundamental architecture, until the Mark IV arrived in 1970 with the redesigned swing spring rear suspension that finally solved it properly. The cars before 1970 required skill to drive at speed. Good drivers loved the challenge. Less experienced drivers who got into trouble in corners were in a very different situation entirely. This was the Spitfire's hidden cost, the thing nobody put in the advertisement, and yet the cars kept selling, because even with that flaw, nothing else at that price gave you this much. But something else was coming. Something imposed from outside that would quietly change what Americans were actually buying without most of them ever knowing it. Here is the part of the Triumph Spitfire story that should make you raise an eyebrow. The cars sold to American buyers were not the same as the cars sold in Britain. As U.S. emissions regulations tightened through the late 1960s and into the 70s, Triumph faced the choice every European manufacturer selling into America faced: modify or lose the market. They modified. The American market Spitfire received a single Zenith Stromberg carburetor in place of the twin SU units fitted to British cars. The compression ratio was dropped to allow the engine to run on lower-octane unleaded fuel. American headlight height regulations forced Triumph to fit longer front springs to raise the nose, altering the suspension geometry and compromising the handling in the process. The result was a car that looked identical to its British counterpart, but performed noticeably differently. American buyers were paying the same price for a less powerful, slightly compromised version of the car their British counterparts were driving. This wasn't hidden exactly, the specifications were in the documentation if you looked carefully. But it was certainly not something Triumph's American dealers were highlighting on the showroom floor. The Spitfire 1500, introduced in the United States in 1973, represented the final evolution of the model. The engine had grown to 1,493 cubic centimeters. Torque was improved, making the car more pleasant in daily traffic, but the American version remained the weaker of the two. Meanwhile, British Leyland, the sprawling corporate entity that had absorbed Triumph along with Jaguar, Rover, MG, and a dozen other marques, was coming apart at the seams. Industrial disputes, quality control failures, the relentless pressure of Japanese competitors offering better reliability at lower prices. The Spitfire continued to sell, but the energy around it had changed. By the late 1970s, the elegant chrome bumpers that had defined the Spitfire's face were replaced on the 1979 and 80 models with black rubber units mounted on chassis extensions. Practical, legal, but a blow to a car whose beauty had always been one of its strongest arguments. The Spitfire was aging. British Leyland had no capital to invest in a replacement. The story that had started in a moment of inspiration in a Turin design studio was moving toward an ending. And on August 25, 1980, it arrived. The last Triumph Spitfire rolled off the production line at the Canley factory in Coventry. Inca yellow, UK specification, factory hardtop, overdrive fitted. It was never sold to the public. It was preserved immediately, as if everyone present understood they were watching the end of something irreplaceable. That car sits today at the British Motor Museum. The factory closed shortly after. The Triumph brand itself was retired by British Leyland in 1984. The company that had negotiated for the name of a wartime fighter plane, that had won at Geneva and Sebring and dozens of SCCA events, that had put nearly 142,000 cars into American hands, gone. Production had ended, as the vintage Triumph register noted plainly, as the car fell victim to short-sighted management, American regulations, and an unfavorable dollar-to-pound exchange rate. Three forces, none dramatic on their own, combining to extinguish something that had genuinely mattered. But here is what makes this story worth sitting with. The Spitfire wasn't killed because people stopped loving it. It was killed by the institutional failures of the company that made it, not by any failure of the car itself. And that distinction changes everything about what the ending means. Why did the Spitfire matter so much? Not to the accountants or the regulators, to the men who drove them. What was it about this particular small, imperfect, occasionally terrifying little British Roadster that made so many Americans feel something they couldn't quite name? The answer isn't horsepower. It isn't top speed. It isn't any number that fits neatly in a specification table. The answer is honesty. The Triumph Spitfire was honest in a way that very few cars before or since have managed. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. It didn't insulate you from the road. It was light under 1,000 kilograms. The engine sat right in front of you. The steering talked to your hands constantly. The road told you exactly what it was doing through the seat of your trousers. There was no buffer between you and the act of driving. In the 1960s and 70s, American cars were going in precisely the opposite direction. Bigger, heavier, more isolated. Soft suspension, power steering with almost no feedback. Interiors designed to feel like a living room. The American automobile of that era was engineered to make driving feel effortless and disconnected. The Spitfire was the antidote to all of that. It demanded your attention. It rewarded your skill. It made you a participant rather than a passenger. The man who bought one, who had grown up with the name Spitfire in his imagination, who was working hard and building a life, and occasionally wondering where the adventure had gone, that man felt something behind the wheel that he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt present, genuinely, physically, undeniably alive in the moment. The car's flaws were part of that. The swing axle that demanded respect, the British electrics that required patience, the rust that required vigilance. Owning a Spitfire was a relationship, not a transaction. You had to give something to get something, and what you got back was considerable. Today, Spitfires are still out there, on roads in California and Ohio and the English countryside, being driven by people who understand exactly what they have, and by people who are only just discovering it. Parts are still manufactured. Restoration specialists still have full order books. A well-kept example still draws a crowd wherever it goes. The Spitfire outlived Triumph. It outlived British Leyland. It outlived the industrial era that produced it. And here's the honest truth. No car that came after it, the Roadsters of the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s, ever quite managed to bottle what this one did naturally. Because the Spitfire wasn't engineered to deliver a sports car experience, it simply was one. The last one is sitting in a museum in Warwickshire, Inca yellow, hardtop fitted, perfect and preserved, and slightly heartbreaking, the way the last of anything always is. But the other 314,000, they're still telling the story. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment below. What does the Triumph Spitfire mean to you? Did you own one, ride in one, or is this the first time you've heard the full story? Every comment matters and we read every one. If this video moved something, hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find content like this. And if you know someone who lived through this era and would appreciate what we just covered, share it with them right now. Some stories deserve a wider audience. This is one of them.